Gothic horror was first established as a genre by this guy called Horace Walpole in a work called The Castle of Otranto, which came out in 1764. Horace Walpole was influenced a lot by Shakespeare, and if you read Hamlet and The Castle of Otranto, you can see a lot of similarities between the two works, such as sort of the dark, gloomy castle. The Castle of Otranto thus sort of first established the genre, but was of course influenced by earlier works. Early Gothic horror heavily features discussions of morality and philosophy. The villains often act as a metaphor. So, for example, in Frankenstein, the monster is a symbol for Frankenstein, or just like mankind in general's hubris or unslakable kind of thirst for scientific advancement. Gothic horror settings often include dilapidated castles, gloomy forests, and cobbled Victorian estates. They are places with like a rich historical background. So as I've mentioned, important figures in Gothic horror include Shakespeare and Horace Walpole. Also, you've got like Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, and of course, Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Gothic horror was big during the Victorian era. The Victorian era spans sort of 1837 to 1901. All of the above works that I just mentioned, other than The Castle of Otranto, came out during this period. You see a lot of things that Victorians were obsessed with coming out in modern Gothic works. So, for instance, death. There was a lot of sexual repression going on at the time. You also get a lot of this trope of like the mad woman in an asylum in Gothic literature. You also have stuff like spiritualism tends to feature a lot in Gothic horror, and that is unsurprising again because during that time sort of seances and that kind of thing were a very popular form of entertainment, and you've got like psychic mediums and stuff. So now we're going to talk about Gothic horror cinema. Gothic horror saw a boom during the early days of cinema with the release of film adaptations, and many of the above novels such as Universal's Dracula in 1931 and Frankenstein in 1931. These are the films with like Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff, and these guys, they sort of have crystallized in our minds this modern image of these monsters. Dracula in 1931 and Frankenstein 1931, they're pretty faithful to the original, although some minor stuff has been changed. One thing I found interesting as well about these films was the fact of how they contained little aftermath. So in both films, the monster is killed and the movies like basically end immediately. You don't get this kind of picture of like the happy world that now exists. Moving on from those early days, you get another wave of Gothic horror films in the 60s. So Gothic horror was named after Gothic castles and crumbling medieval ruins. But over time, you get these more contemporary locations. So for example, in the film The Haunting of Hill House, they're set in very contemporary locations. What essentially defines the Gothic is this uneasy environment that evokes dread.
Violet ray, the ultraviolet ray, which you said was the highest color in the spectrum.
So these later Gothic horror films carry through some of the key motifs. You've got this unresolved conflicts depicted in a symbolic manner, so unresolved conflicts of the protagonist. In Robert Eggers' 2015 film The Lighthouse, you have a lot of symbolism. You also have a lot of weird kind of sexual stuff going on in that film. And again, I just want to draw attention to the fact that this is a common theme in Gothic horror, and another example of that is even just the film Black Swan. If you think about Nina Sayer's character in that, she's kind of this young, naive, sexually inexperienced or repressed. And again, this is a perfect example of how the Victorian era has shaped the Gothic horror genre. My interpretation of Gothic horror along this vein is about how there's sort of unresolved conflict in the protagonist. Because the protagonist is sort of under stress and there's like something they haven't dealt with, often they're sort of running away from something. This starts to manifest in the real world, either in the form of them kind of losing the plot in this eerie location, or the conflict is sort of represented symbolically in the antagonist. Briefly, further evidence for my idea is this thread of the rational versus the supernatural. We have some stressor upon us. There's a part of us, like the rational part of our brain, that tells us we're just being silly. So I think this sort of common theme of the rational versus the supernatural sort of probably stems from that particular phenomenon. In Gothic horror, there's also an external character often who's like telling the main character, oh, it's all nonsense, you're just imagining things. As I mentioned, with modern Gothic horror, you get these more modern settings, but the underlying themes are the same. I imagine certain social conditions are more conducive towards certain genres. For example, right now there's so much horror coming out. I had to walk out of the film The Substance. So I imagine that if social conditions are uneasy, then you probably get more Gothic horror works produced. Gothic horror has been popular when it first came out in the 1760s to the 1790s. It was also popular during the Victorian era from the 1830s to 1900s. It was then again popular from the 1920s to 30s. There was then a revival of interest in the 60s and 70s of Gothic horror. In the 1990s and 2000s, you get a resurgence again. Finally, in 2010 until present, the genre has continued to evolve, often blending with other genres and addressing contemporary issues. Gothic horror often blends well with other genres. Notable combinations include romantic Gothic, so you have films like Jane Eyre and Rebecca, which infuse this romance with Gothic settings. You have Gothic fantasy, movies like Pan's Labyrinth or The Others. You have Gothic thrillers, works such as The Sixth Sense and The Others. And then you have as well Gothic comedy like What We Do in the Shadows, and you have Gothic science fiction movies like Blade Runner and The Shape of Water. So, as a takeaway, I think that Gothic horror is really interesting, and having a knowledge of the various elements can be very useful if one wants to create a genre in this work. Knowing the typical settings of Gothic horror, like dilapidated castles, gloomy forests, cobbled Victorian estates, as well as the themes of Gothic horror like repression, unresolved tension, or kind of repressed sexuality, and this battle, often between humanity and evil that's taking place within a sort of bleak landscape. Knowing these can be very helpful. I think it's cool also the idea just of the antagonist being a kind of symbol for some inner turmoil of the protagonist. For myself, knowing consciously the elements of Gothic horror is going to help me understand the Gothic horror that I've been making. So I think understanding Gothic horror in this way means that our work can be more refined and have a greater impact.